The world knew Ace Frehley as the Space Ace, the silver-starred guitar hero who helped build the biggest rock phenomenon of the '70s. But in 1987, when he finally stepped out from behind that iconic makeup and formed his own band, something unexpected happened. Frehley's Comet should have been a triumph, a phoenix rising from the ashes of Kiss. Instead, it became one of rock music's most frustrating mysteries. The debut album climbed to number 43 on the Billboard 200. The singles burned up rock radio. MTV actually played the videos. And then, like a switch being flipped, everything collapsed. For decades, Ace remained silent about what really happened, until 2015, when he finally spoke the words that changed everything we thought we knew about his post-Kiss years. What he revealed wasn't just about music industry politics or bad luck. It was about systematic sabotage, about powerful forces that couldn't allow the Space Ace to succeed without the makeup, without the Kiss brand, without their control. Before we dive deeper into this incredible story, please subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell. You're about to hear details that most Ace Frehley fans have never encountered, based on interviews, industry documents, and the testimony of people who were there when it all went down. 1987. The year seemed perfect for Ace Frehley's reinvention. He had survived the darkest period of his life, those brutal years after leaving Kiss in 1982 when addiction nearly destroyed him. By '86, he was clean, focused, and creatively energized in ways he hadn't felt since the mid-'70s. The guitar that had been silent for so many months was singing again, and this time it was playing music that came entirely from Paul Daniel Frehley, not from the Space Ace character he'd worn like a second skin for nearly a decade. He assembled a band of hungry young musicians, guys who respected his legacy but weren't intimidated by it. Todd Howarth on rhythm guitar and vocals brought a melodic sensibility that complemented Ace's raw power. John Regan on bass provided the solid foundation that Ace had always needed. Anton Fig on drums, a session veteran who'd worked with everyone from Bob Dylan to Joe Cocker, gave the band a professional backbone. This wasn't going to be a nostalgia act. This was going to be Ace Frehley proving he was more than just a quarter of Kiss. The sessions for the first Frehley's Comet album crackled with energy. Ace was writing prolifically, drawing from the pain and redemption of his recovery journey, channeling his anger at how Kiss had minimized his contributions, pouring his renewed love of pure rock and roll into every track. Rock Soldiers, the lead single, was an anthem for anyone who'd ever fought their way back from the edge. Into the Night showcased the melodic sophistication that people forgot Ace possessed when they only remembered his party rock persona. Calling to You revealed vulnerability that the Space Ace mask had never allowed. And then there was Breakout, a song that seemed to capture everything Ace was feeling about escaping the confines of his past and claiming his future. When Megaforce Records, the independent label that had launched Metallica's career, signed Frehley's Comet, there was genuine excitement in the industry. This could work. This could be huge. The album dropped in April of '87, and the initial response exceeded even optimistic expectations. Rock Soldiers climbed into the top 30 on the mainstream rock chart. The video got legitimate rotation on MTV, not just during the late-night hours, but in actual daytime slots. Album-oriented rock stations across America added multiple tracks to their playlists. Concert promoters were calling with offers for theater tours, small arenas, festival slots. Music magazines wanted interviews. The rock press, which could be cruel to aging glam rockers trying to stay relevant, actually treated Ace with respect, acknowledging that he was doing something artistically valid rather than just cashing in on faded glory. By summer, Frehley's Comet had sold over 200,000 copies, respectable numbers for a new band on an independent label, especially impressive for a former KISS member trying to establish a separate identity. Ace was experiencing something he hadn't felt in years, genuine hope about his musical future. But behind the scenes, in offices and conference rooms Ace never entered, conversations were happening that would determine his fate. The KISS Corporation, even in its mid-'80s dormancy with Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley pursuing separate projects, remained a legal and financial entity with substantial power. The contracts Ace had signed back in the 70s, the agreements he'd made when leaving the band in '82, contained clauses and provisions that very few people understood. Rights to the Space Ace character and imagery, restrictions on how he could market himself as a former KISS member, financial arrangements regarding ongoing KISS merchandise sales that used his likeness, and most crucially, connections to management companies and industry gatekeepers who had deep relationships with the KISS organization. Ace was focused on making music, on rebuilding his career one honest song at a time. He didn't realize that his success was being viewed as a threat by people who had invested heavily in the narrative that KISS was the brand and the individual members were interchangeable parts. The second Frehley's Comet album, Second Sighting, released in May of '88, should have built on the momentum of the first. The material was strong, perhaps even stronger than the debut. Ace was more confident in the studio, more willing to experiment, more trusting of his instincts. Insane, the lead single, had hit potential written all over it. It's Over Now showed emotional depth. Loser in A Fight had the kind of arena rock punch that American rock radio loved in the late '80s. The band had toured extensively behind the first album, building a dedicated fan base, proving they could deliver live. Everything was in place for Frehley's Comet to take the next step, to move from cult success to mainstream breakthrough. Ace had done everything right. He'd gotten clean, assembled a real band, written genuine songs, worked the promotion circuit, played the shows. This was supposed to be how it worked. Talent plus effort equals success, right? Except the machine had already started working against him. Radio programmers who'd championed rock soldiers suddenly became lukewarm about Insane. MTV, which had given decent support to the first album's videos, barely acknowledged the second album existed. Music journalists who'd praised Ace's reinvention now seemed disinterested in covering his follow-up. Tour support from Megaforce, which had been solid for the first album, became inconsistent. Promotional budgets seemed to evaporate. Retail placement in record stores became spotty, and Ace, still relatively naive about music industry politics despite his years in KISS, couldn't understand why. The music was good. The performances were solid. The fan base was growing. What had changed? What he didn't know, what he couldn't see, was the systematic campaign happening in the background. Phone calls from powerful management companies to radio consultants, suggestions from industry veterans to MTV programmers, quiet conversations between major label executives and independent distributors. Nothing overt, nothing that could be proven, nothing that left a paper trail. Just the steady application of pressure at every level of the music industry ecosystem. By 1989, Frehley's Comet was effectively finished, and Ace still didn't fully understand why. Third album sessions were abandoned. The band lineup began to fracture. Megaforce, facing their own financial pressures and unable to break through the invisible wall, that had been erected around Ace's solo career effectively dropped the project. Concert offers dried up. The momentum that had seemed so real just 2 years earlier had completely dissipated. Ace found himself back in the wilderness, questioning whether he'd imagined the brief success, wondering if maybe the critics had been right all along. Maybe he really was just a quarter of Kiss. Maybe without the makeup and the brand he was nothing. This psychological warfare was perhaps the cruelest part of the Sabotage. It wasn't just about denying Ace commercial success. It was about making him doubt himself, making him question his worth, making him believe that his only value was as a nostalgic piece of the Kiss empire. The 90s were difficult years for Ace. He bounced between small labels, released albums that got minimal promotion, watched from the sidelines as grunge and alternative rock dominated the mainstream, saw younger guitarists cite him as an influence while his own career languished in obscurity. He did reunion shows with Kiss in the mid-90s, put the Space Ace makeup back on, played the hits for arena crowds who went wild for the nostalgia. The money was good. The validation felt necessary. But every time he put on that silver star makeup, every time he became the character instead of the man, a piece of him died. He'd tried to escape. He'd proven he could create valid music outside the Kiss context. And he'd been systematically destroyed for that audacity. The message was clear. You can be Space Ace, or you can be nothing. But you can't be Paul Daniel Frehley, successful recording artist. It took Ace years to piece together what had actually happened. Conversations with sympathetic industry insiders who'd witnessed the pressure campaigns. Admissions from radio programmers who felt guilty about the playlisting decisions they'd been influenced to make. Former Megaforce employees who'd seen the obstacles that had been placed in the label's path. Lawyers reviewing his old Kiss contracts, who pointed out clauses that had been weaponized against his solo success. The picture that emerged was damning. Kiss management, working in conjunction with major music industry players who had financial stakes in the Kiss brand's value, had engaged in a coordinated effort to ensure that Ace Frehley could not succeed as a solo artist at a level that might diminish the perceived importance of the Kiss entity. It wasn't personal, in their view. It was business. The Kiss brand was worth hundreds of millions of dollars in potential future earnings from tours, merchandise, licensing. If Ace proved that a former member could have significant success outside the band, it threatened the narrative that Kiss was irreplaceable, that the makeup characters were more important than the men who wore them. They couldn't allow that, so they made sure he failed. 2015. Ace Frehley sat for an interview and finally, after decades of silence, spoke the truth. He was 74 years old, beyond caring about burning bridges or protecting reputations. His recent solo albums, released on his own label without major industry support, had been critically acclaimed and modestly successful with his loyal fan base. He'd made peace with his place in rock history, and he was ready to tell the story of what happened to Frehley's Comet. Not with bitterness, but with the clarity of someone who'd survived and persevered. The interviewer asked about the late 80s, about why such a promising project had collapsed so completely. And Ace, looking directly into the camera, said the words, "I was sabotaged. By people connected to Kiss. By people in the industry who had relationships with Kiss management. By people who couldn't allow me to succeed outside that framework. It was systematic. It was deliberate. And it almost destroyed me." The revelation sent shockwaves through the classic rock community. Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley, who'd rebuilt Kiss into a touring juggernaut in the 2000s and 2010s, denied any direct involvement. Their camp issued statements about Ace being unable to accept responsibility for his own career failures, about substance abuse issues affecting his work in the 80s, about the natural difficulties of transitioning from a major band to a solo career. But people who'd been there, people who'd witnessed the behind-the-scenes maneuvering, began coming forward with their own stories. A former radio consultant admitted he'd been pressured to deprioritize Frehley's Comet tracks. An MTV programmer confirmed that suggestions had been made about limiting video rotation. A Megaforce executive revealed that distribution deals had been mysteriously complicated by interference from larger industry players. The pattern was undeniable. Ace hadn't failed because his music wasn't good enough, or because audiences didn't want to hear him. He'd failed because powerful forces had decided he needed to fail. Looking back now, the Frehley's Comet Sabotage represents something larger than just one musician's thwarted career. It illuminates the dark machinery of the music industry in the corporate rock era, the ways that branding and intellectual property control could be weaponized against individual artists. The cynical calculation that human beings were less important than logos and trademarks. Ace Frehley had given Kiss nearly a decade of his life, had helped create something culturally significant, had contributed guitar work and songwriting that became part of rock history. And when he tried to move forward as an independent artist, when he tried to prove his worth outside that framework, the industry that had profited from his talent decided he needed to be taught a lesson. He was supposed to be grateful for the crumbs, grateful for the reunion opportunities, grateful to put the makeup back on whenever Gene and Paul decided it was financially advantageous. He wasn't supposed to succeed on his own terms. The truly tragic part is wondering what could have been. If Frehley's Comet had been allowed to grow organically, if Second Sighting had received the promotion and support it deserved, if Ace had been permitted to build a second-act career based on artistic merit rather than nostalgia, what might have happened? Could he have become one of the successful classic rockers who transitioned into respected elder statesmen of the genre? Could his story have been one of redemption and renaissance rather than frustration and suppression? We'll never know, because that possibility was deliberately strangled in its infancy by people who viewed Ace Frehley not as a human being with artistic dreams, but as a brand asset to be controlled and managed. When he stepped outside their control, they reminded him, with systematic cruelty, exactly who held the power. Today, Ace continues making music on his own terms. His 2010s solo albums, released independently, have found their audience without the support or interference of the major music industry. He plays shows for fans who appreciate both his Kiss legacy and his post-Kiss work. He's survived addiction, industry betrayal, financial exploitation, and the slow erasure that the music business inflicts on artists it deems past their commercial prime. And he's told his truth about what happened to Frehley's Comet, not seeking revenge but simply refusing to let the lie stand unchallenged. The Space Ace character will always be part of his legacy, that silver-starred icon that helped define 70s rock spectacle. But Paul Daniel Frehley, the man behind the makeup, the guitarist who kept creating even when the industry tried to silence him, the survivor who wouldn't let them break his spirit even when they broke his career, that's the legacy that matters more. That's the story of real courage in the face of systemic opposition. The Frehley's Comet Sabotage wasn't just about destroying one band or derailing one career. It was about sending a message to every artist who might consider challenging the corporate structures that profit from their creativity. Stay in your lane. Accept your role. Don't imagine you're more important than the brand. And if you try to prove otherwise, we have the power to destroy you. Ace Frehley learned that lesson the hardest way possible, through years of wondering why his best efforts weren't good enough, why doors kept closing despite the quality of his work, why the industry that had once elevated him now seemed determined to keep him down. When he finally understood the truth, when he finally saw the full scope of what had been done to him, it could have destroyed him. Instead, it freed him. Because once you understand that your failure wasn't your fault, that you were fighting against forces far larger than yourself, you can stop internalizing the defeat and start recognizing the courage it took to fight in the first place. In the end, the story of Frehley's Comet is a reminder that talent and hard work aren't always enough. Sometimes the game is rigged. Sometimes powerful people decide your success threatens their interests. Sometimes the machine that built you up decides you need to be torn down. Ace Frehley's crime was believing he could be more than what others had decided he should be. His punishment was watching his dream systematically dismantled by forces he couldn't see and couldn't fight. His victory, small but real, was surviving it all and living long enough to tell the truth. The Space Ace may have been created in a corporate boardroom, designed to sell tickets and merchandise and albums, but the man who wore that makeup, who created those guitar parts, who wrote those songs, who fought to prove his worth even when the world tried to convince him he had none, that man was real. And his story, the true story behind the sabotage of Frehley's Comet, deserves to be told and remembered, not as a bitter footnote, but as a testament to artistic courage in the face of industry cruelty.